His practice engages with photography, moving image, sound, and media installation. His photographs have been exhibited and his audio and video works shown at festivals internationally and nationally in Ontario, Arizona, California, New York, Chicago, Spain. So we're thrilled to have you here at the museum. He's also the inaugural recipient of the Prefix Prize in Photography in 2021. Again, lovely. So happy that you're here in our institution. But also, he's very much a McMaster colleague. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies and Media Arts. And he also is represented in town by Smokestack Studios.
Thanks, Carol. And thank you, everyone, for coming out today. But before I begin, I want to express my sincere gratitude to all of the people that made this show possible. The Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, the Arts Research Board here at McMaster, who were provided the financial support for the production and the research and the production behind all of these works. Smokestack Studios, who, as Carol mentioned, represent me for this show and are responsible for the printing of every single one of the images you see on the wall. Also, Ivan Jurkic for the curatorial consultation as we were putting Humpty Dumpty together here. But most importantly, the very talented and hardworking folks at the MMA. Betty and Carol for giving me this opportunity in the first place. Nicole, Julie, Kate, Olga, Teresa, Liana, and Iza for wrapping this show in such coherent and accessible information and then sort of getting it out there for the larger public. And of course, Sam, who was instrumental in taking what on paper looked to be an impossible installation and making it not only a reality, but also a process that I really enjoyed. So the Salience exhibition is essentially a mid-career retrospective, and it's something I've been working toward for the better part of a decade, and it brings together photography, audio, and loosely sculptural works from 8 interrelated projects that revolve around our complex interrelationships with water. And not only the ecological dimension to that, but the ways in which water influences and shapes culture, industry, the collective imagination. The catalyst for this work was the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And for various personal reasons, that event had a really profound impact on my worldview, and it also led to a series of really profound, pivotal revelations that I've been unpacking ever since in the studio and through my research. One of these has to do with the paradox or the tension whereby water acts simultaneously as both a generative and constructive influence, as well as an agent of immense and often unpredictable destructive power. So all the works in this exhibition point back to that idea in one way or another, to that dynamic in one way or another. But when I pitched this idea to Carol, which was like 5 years ago or something like that, what I wanted to do was sort of tie everything together through this notion of salience. And I want to thank my good friend and colleague Liz Platt for introducing that word to my lexicon. And years ago, Liz wrote a letter of recommendation for me, and in that letter, she was writing about the work that you see there, these diptychs that are sort of crawling up the wall. That's a really early work called Vessel's Undertone. What you're looking at are these large glass jugs that were half buried under the Atlantic Ocean for very, very long periods of time. So in the diptychs, on one side, you see the part of the jug that was buried in the sediment, where there's no light and there's no oxygen. And then the other half of the diptych, you see the part of the object that was facing upward toward light and oxygen, which of course are necessary for all these tiny little marine life forms that you see sort of establishing themselves on the object. So when Liss was writing about the conceptual dimension of that work, what she said was, Meyer ruminates on two salient features of photography, time and light. And I remember thinking, wow, she's nailed it. But I don't know what salient means. So I've done my homework, and I've been thinking about that word for a very long time now. And when we describe something as being salient, we're talking about the thing that is most important, the thing that has the most weight, the wheat that gets separated from the chaff. But also in geography and geometry, a salient is a prominent feature in a landscape or of a shape that sort of juts out from the background into the foreground, sort of gesturing for your attention. And so, for example, the iceberg poking up above the surface of the sea gestures for the attention of the sailor. The canine tooth of the unleashed dog gestures for the attention of the runner, something my ankles know firsthand. In a sort of two-dimensional context, a spike on a graph indicating increased mercury toxicity in a body of water over time gestures for the attention of the climate scientist. So as you explore this space, you'll see a variety of references, both formal and conceptual, to that idea. A lot of triangles, a lot of things sort of standing on end, sound emerging from silence. We've got the audio installation down right now, just so that it's not competing with my voice, which doesn't get a lot of exercise these days because I'm on sabbatical. But moreover, the word salient for me has a really interesting affinity to the word saline, which comes from the Latin for salt. And it's a word we, of course, use to describe solid matter dissolved in a solution. And indeed, what we see in these works is not so much the solution, but the salt. What we're looking at is stubborn matter, real stuff that has refused to kind of dissolve into the water system from which it was recovered. And that sort of points toward one of the unifying concepts in this exhibition, and that's the idea of the irreducibility of matter. So, like energy, matter cannot be destroyed. It simply moves from one form or state to another, from one location to another, and in certain cases, from one body to another. And on a much broader level, in terms of some of the more ecologically motivated works, what we're looking at are the byproducts of some very complex and very messy ecological challenges, environmental challenges that simply won't dissolve away into kind of conventional frameworks of Euro-Western thought. There's no linear single cause to these effects. These are issues for which there's no sort of nice and easy on-off switch. I like to think of these issues more like Mobius strips made of fly paper, so that you sort of dive into that sticky issue and you thrash around a little bit, and then you end up sort of back where you started, often looking at yourself in the face. So before I take you for a speed date of all of the works in the room, one of the things I want to talk about are some of the curatorial strategies that are at play here, because for me, this exhibition is more like an art installation than it is an installation of artworks. And what I mean by that is the architecture and the space are working very closely in tandem with the artworks in a way that generates meaning, in a way that sort of hopefully is underscoring and pointing towards some of the central concepts in the work. So one of the first things you'll notice, obviously, when you walk in the room, is the way in which we've sort of leveraged the vertical dimensions of the Sherman Gallery space. And although this wasn't a conscious thing, I think there are some interesting connections to the previous We Are Made of Stardust show, fantastic exhibition, which was also playing a lot with the verticality of the space. However, that show was about sort of like looking up and sort of contemplating your relationship with the cosmos. Salience, on the other hand, is more about matter and about gravity. It's about looking down and contemplating like the ground underneath your feet and the stuff that you can hold in front of your eyes. So there are a series of horizon lines that we established in the space. The first one is this one, which we were calling ground level. And it's on ground level that the speakers and the three-dimensional stuff, like these little sculptural elements, and thank you to Christina Durka for giving me the license to use the sculpture word. So it's the plane on which the three-dimensional stuff sits. And then the two-dimensional things, the photographic works, are then arranged along three additional horizon lines. The first one being, of course, just like regular gallery 57-inch eye level. And then above and below that, we established these two horizon lines that we're calling high tide and low tide. So the works kind of modulate along those three horizon lines. And so the objective, of course, was to activate the space on a number of axes, not just that sort of eye level, the sort of conventional eye level horizon, but also to reference things like the ebb and flow of tides, condensation, evaporation, inhalation, exhalation, sunrise, sunset, etc., etc. And for me, as someone who works a lot with sound, one of the things I appreciate about this presentation strategy is, for me, there's also kind of a musical dimension to it. There's something about like notes on a score or audio waveforms. And you may also notice, as you start to kind of spend time with the work, that there's a whole lot of circularity going on. Not only do we have like circles in some of the works themselves, but we have an audio installation that when it's running, it loops and it cycles between these two states, that I'll talk about shortly. Also, if you squint your eyes and sort of very carefully look around the room, one of the things, in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction, you'll notice that we were very careful to arrange the images so that they transition in tonality from light to dark, back to light again, and vice versa. And so again, this was an effort to animate work that, my work by its very nature is very still and very quiet. So this was a way to animate the work, but also a way to animate and activate bodies in the space. A way to engage not only with the eyes, but also with the ears, and maybe even the nose if you want to get up close and personal to any one of those sculptures. I wouldn't recommend it, but by all means. I also think, like, as I've been sort of thinking about the work, I also feel that there's this kind of like haptic vision synesthesia thing going on, whereby we feel things through our eyes and through our ears in this show. And so, like, if you look at the little sculptural works again, they're smooth and they're slimy and they're shiny, and they're just begging you to reach out and poke them and sort of like check out what they might feel like. Don't do it because your fingers will be stained and everyone will think that you're chain smoking. Also, the images on the back wall, the wall behind you, those images are highly detailed and they have a really sort of sandy and gritty feel to them, like a real sort of material presence. So, and I guess I should also mention that this emphasis on like direct phenomenological embodied experience is a really important tenet to my art practice in general. And although like I'm a media artist and I spend most of my life pushing around pixels, I'm also someone who makes work that at its most fundamental level is addressing the body, and work that I hope speaks to the idea of the senses as this sort of crucial site through which we generate and stabilize knowledge, not only about artwork, but about the world at large. And the other thing we were talking a lot about was that by designing the space in this way and sort of addressing a broader sensorium, what we're doing is that we're also allowing for different kinds of bodies to engage with the work. Not only bodies that sort of experience the world, at gallery 57 inches, like I do, but also bodies that might experience the world at different horizon lines. Bodies like Sam's that are up there at like high tide. But let's start down here at ground level and talk about works and what's going on. So again, I've got these, the sound installation off for now, but we'll patch back into the system and fire it up after my talk. But the sound installation is a piece called Sounding Waters, Hamilton Harbor, and it's a redux of a work I did in Gage Park, which some people saw years ago in 2019. And what it is it's a looping audio composition. Interestingly, it's the only actual direct reference to water in the show. Everything else, as I mentioned, sort of like talks about water indirectly. But it's a looping audio composition featuring a series of underwater recordings I took by foot and by kayak in Hamilton Harbor and its tributaries. And it's what I like to call a sound map. And what I mean by that is the recordings are arranged in the stereo spectrum of left to right in a way that corresponds to the geography of the water system. So for example, that speaker over there is east. So that is the QEW bridge. That's the mouth of the harbor as it empties into Lake Ontario. That speaker over there is west, and that is the creeks and ponds of the Royal Botanical Gardens. And then in between that, we have like the industrial area behind the steel mills here. We have my hood here. We have like the various piers all along the waterfront trail that again lead into the RBG. So the composition is 5 to 6 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly, in length. And if you listen to it, if you spend time with it, you'll note that it also cycles and transitions gradually from recordings of the soundscape in the summer to recordings that were taken beneath the ice flow during the winter months. Okay, so again, coming back to this idea of natural cycles. So my favorite part of the show, these quote-unquote sculpture elements, which consist of globs of hydrocarbon that I collected along the western shoreline of Point Pelee Peninsula. A peninsula, by the way, is a salient. And Pelee serves as a kind of scoop that picks up all of the stuff that enters Lake Erie from the Detroit River and the various currents that are pushing the water eastward toward the Niagara River. So I was on the beaches of Pelee, walking up and down, photographing the detritus that washes up there. A lot of it, as you can imagine, is plastics. When one of these like jet black rocks just happened to, which I initially mistook to just be part of the landscape, just like caught the sunlight at the perfect angle, and it created that sort of like rainbow sheen effect that you see if you've seen like a thin layer of oil on a puddle. That's what I'm talking about. And so, I reached down and I picked it up and I realized that it wasn't a rock, and it wasn't charcoal. It was squishy and sticky and stinky like tar. And unfortunately, the presence of tar on that shoreline makes sense because a lot of hydrocarbon waste finds its way into Lake Erie via underwater dumping sites, resource extraction in the watershed, and most alarmingly, the coal-fired electrical plant that's just like across the border and upcurrent from Point Pelee Peninsula. So as you circle around the room, the sculptural elements, you'll notice that they alternate from like cohesive form fragments, unified form fragments. And they're very carefully arranged in a way that, like, for example, the rock on the Lake Erie wall, this guy, is exactly 1,102 grams. And as we move clockwise, the pile of little fragments on that wall is also 1,102 grams. And so similarly, that rock back there is 881 grams, that pile is 881 grams. So what I'm trying to do there is both visually and conceptually point again toward this idea of the irreducibility of matter, which I outlined earlier. So the sculptural works, lead us directly to these photographs on this wall. This is a series called Absolutes Lake Erie, and what you're looking at, of course, are photographic representations of that sediment. And in these photos, foreground and background relationships, as well as that salient feature of light that Liz talked about in the letter I mentioned earlier, are really crucial access points to the work. So I'm really interested in an idea that comes out of current discourse around the Anthropocene, which of course means this theory that we're entering into, or we have entered into, an era in which humanity is acting on the earth with the kind of force and influence of geophysical force. And so one of the ideas I've been thinking a lot about is that, and again, I should specify that this is a line of Euro-Western thought, but one of the ideas I've been thinking a lot about is this idea that in order to define this thing called humanity in the way that it's defined and kind of elevated in Euro-Western thought, we also need this kind of completely separate realm called nature. And moreover, in order for humanity to claim sovereignty or dominion over nature, that realm needs to act as like a passive or inert backdrop, okay? So to kind of like tie that all together, essentially like humanity equals subject slash active, nature equals object slash passive. So you can see how problematic that is and how that sort of thinking has gotten us to where the state of affairs that we're dealing with now. But what happens in that, with that kind of thinking when the line between humanity and nature starts to collapse? That's a question that I get really excited about. And that's what those images are trying to engage with. And so if you look at the photos very carefully, you'll notice that they've been very carefully lit in a way that I've separated them from their background, which is what you do. That's like photo portraiture 101. But if you look at the darkest parts of those images, the tonality of the figure is exactly the same as the tonality of the background. So essentially, the figure starts to flatten into the background. Background becomes foreground, foreground becomes background. Going back to that Mobius strip idea I talked about a little bit earlier. And so those things become inextricable from one another. And I also work really hard with these images to kind of give them, going back to like my synesthetic way of thinking about images, I tried to give them this kind of like low rumbling imperial march kind of feel. And I like to think of them as the kind of artwork that like Darth Vader would hang above his waterbed. So from the yin to the yang, on the back wall, that is a series of images. It's a companion series to the Erie work called Absolute's Athabasca River. And that work was done in collaboration with Dr. Jane Kirk and Amber Gleason of Environment and Climate Change Canada, who are researchers in the Aquatic Contaminants Division at the Canada Centre for Inland Waters in Burlington. And what you're looking at in those images is a bird's eye view of one of these. This is a sample pack, and the researchers use these sample packs to study the consistency of snow. So they'll scoop up some snow, the snow melts through this filter, they study the constitution of the water that comes into the receptacle on the bottom, as well as the solid material, the salient material that collects on the top, okay? So these particular samples come from snow falling along the banks of the Athabasca River as it runs from the Columbia Glacier on the border of BC and Alberta through the oil sands region of northern Alberta and Fort McMurray up into the water systems of the Northwest Territories, and then of course via numerous tributaries into the waters of the Atlantic Ocean and the Arctic. So there are 7 images in the full series, but those 3, very much like the sound installation, are arranged in a way that refers to the geography of the water system itself. So that nasty looking image on the far right, that is a sample taken as close as you can get to the Suncor extraction and production site in Fort McMurray. The ones to the left are upriver. Did I get that right? Yes, upriver. So the one on the left is closest to the glacier, and then the water flows from left to right towards Suncor. So just to sort of decode color and tonality, the brown detritus, the brown sediment you see in the middle image, that is light particulate matter coming from smokestacks, okay? The black sediment you see on the far right, that of course is like crude oil falling from the sky. So if seeing is believing, it doesn't take much to kind of understand that this kind of heavy-handed resource extraction, not only impacts the immediate terrestrial environment, but it also finds its way into the interconnected Earth systems of atmosphere and hydrosphere, okay? And the researchers at the center are grappling with the more slippery question of like, how do these contaminants impact human and non-human bodies as they start to kind of circulate outward through rivers, lakes, and then the larger ocean system. So staying with the idea of slipperiness, on the wall to my left, that's a series called Suspensions. And what you're looking at are evaporated samples of blue-green algae collected in Hamilton Harbor and evaporated onto scientific glass, stacked on top of a film scanner, and then rendered into these large composite photographs. So blue-green algae is something that I encounter a lot when I'm running along the harbor or kayaking in the harbor. And if you haven't seen it, in worst case scenarios, it's like a thick layer of green meat that sits on top of the water, and it's all like embedded with bits and pieces of human and non-human detritus that it sort of sucks up as it sort of moves around. But it is, in fact, a photosynthetic bacteria that's currently blanketing large sections of the Great Lakes as well as other inland water systems. And due to things like agricultural trends, fertilizer, wastewater overflow, hello Hamilton, as well as the effect of global warming. It's compounded by that sort of thing. And then what these things do is they basically rob an ecosystem of its oxygen and of its light, and you can imagine what the ramifications of that are. So what I'm interested, or what got me interested in the first place, was this idea that something like on a microbial scale could, proliferate to the point where collectively these blooms can be seen from space. So you can see the kind of like ambiguity between like microscope, telescope, aerial photography, micro, macro, that I think is at play in those images. So how can I'm interested in how these tiny entities can colonize these vast bodies of water and essentially bring entire ecosystems to their knees. That work also got me thinking a lot about, again, a very Euro-Western idea, which is this sort of out of sight, out of mind attitude we have toward waste and water. So like, as long as I don't see the shit that I'm pumping into the harbor, it's not a problem, right? Again, bringing it back to a more local issue. But as the Godzilla allegory reminds us, we're never really done with the stuff that we leave in our wake, especially if it's really nasty stuff. And in the words of Cree educator and researcher Dwayne Donald of the University of Alberta, the past occurs simultaneously with the present and influences how we conceptualize the future. I love the way he ties that up. And this idea of circular time is also at play in the remaining three bodies of work that make up the series. And those three bodies of work are called vessels. Vessels between teeth, vessels undertone, and vessels manifold. And the Vessels series depicts various human-made artifacts that were recovered from the Atlantic seafloor by divers and citizen historians based in Halifax, most notably a writer and historian named Bob Chalk, who I worked very closely with on two video projects. One was called Approaches to Erg, the other one was called Fathoms the Weight of Smoke. And I've already touched on the Undertone series, which is the diptychs of the half-buried glass jugs. But what you see in between teeth and manifold are clay and ceramic sailors' pipes that have been recovered from the seafloor off the coast of Nova Scotia, which I initially discovered in a rusty bucket in Bob Chalk's collection. And I initially mistook them as, well, they immediately jumped out and grabbed my attention because I mistook them as like shards of human bone or like monster teeth of some kind. And when I started to ask questions about them and learn more about them, I realized that they're very old. Some of these date back to the early 1700s, the mid 1800s. Yet, because ceramic and glass are kind of like chewing gum to the digestive tract of the sea, these tiny little entities, these tiny little artifacts, had somehow managed to tumble around down there for centuries and then like end up in my hands. And so that's one of the things that I found so evocative about them in the first place. So again, you'll note that similar sort of experience to the beaches of Lake Erie, where the rock sort of looks up at you and goes, hey, pay attention. Those little pipes were doing the exact same thing in those moments. But what I find so interesting about them, they're interesting archives and typologies of everyday objects relating to seafaring culture. So if you look at the Manifold series, which is like close-ups of the mouthpiece of a number of the pipes, you can see indentations for fingers, indentations for teeth, and B, like inscriptions about spirituality, faith, superstition, nationality, and weirder things. And so I encourage you to go up to this kind of rich brown example here on the far left. You can clearly read the word Glasgow on that stem. So there's this sort of historical archival dimension to it, but when you handle something like that and you work with it very closely, you start to feel a very real sense of connection to the past. This kind of like uncanny connection between like this body through the object and then toward some other body long since past that also once held that thing. And then of course there's like Popeye the Sailor Man, Frosty the Snowman and his corncob pipe, Magritte, Treachery of Images, This Is Not a Pipe, all of that stuff. So I like to think that there is some humor wrapped up in my work somewhere. There's a lot of layers to this show, but I also like to think that there's a great deal of space for alternative readings, alternative access points and angles. And that's one of the reasons that I really like working with abstraction and semi-abstraction in photography, because you can never quite nail everything down. Nothing is ever completely locked down. It's sort of more like a site of potential. And I hope overall the show encourages you to slow down and enjoy some quiet moments of contemplation. And I'll finish by saying that in talks like this one, you know, I'm able, or at least I'm trying to speak in some detail about like ideas and concepts and philosophy and theory, but the work never begins there. Theory and concepts are always sort of bubbling in the background, but like seldom will they, for me anyway, seldom are they the catalysts for the kind of work that I want to make. The process always begins with this kind of exchange, and it's always often an unexpected one, like an exchange between my body and the things in my immediate environment. Kind of exchange going back to that idea of salience, you know, something emerging from the background into the foreground, you know, and an exchange where the thing sort of winks back and gestures for your attention. And though I think it's important to note, I can see a lot of sketchbooks in the audience, so I'm thinking there are emerging artists around. I think it's really important to note that those gestures are often very small and very quiet. And I think as artists and people, we need to find, you know, the register to receive those types of signals from the world around us. And I mean, people of like a phenomenological strain, I'm probably one of them, but I try to avoid that word as much as possible. You know, they will often talk about the need for being open to the world in order to kind of like engage or receive or be, you know, sensitive to gestures like that. And I often think about like, well, what does it mean to be open to the world? What does it mean to be mindful? That's another word that I try to avoid a lot. And I think it means like not only being attentive and not only kind of assuming a position of humility to the world around you, but I think it also means like remaining like wide-eyed, maybe a little naive, and most importantly, like just intensely curious about the world around you and the things that you share that world with. And I really hope that there has been something in this exhibition that has maybe, you know, gestured very quietly toward you And with that, I'll say thank you very much for your time. Jessica, put me to the sword.
Yeah, my question is just like obviously to the exhibition, you are kind of like this, like it's visible, but it's invisible to us because obviously most of these things are just in the water or underwater. But like, how do you see all these materials in the future for yourself? Because at the end, this is also a critique about an ecological critique of materials that should, or matter that shouldn't be in the water. But at the end, by producing this, you're also producing new materials. And also not just these materials, but the process of like these final materials. And at some point, something must be returned to water.
Yeah.
Like a new object returning to water or something.
Yeah, good question. I mean, that's one of these Mobius flypaper strips that I was talking about earlier. And I mean, my practice is deeply invested in, materiality and presenting something in front of bodies for them to experience in space and make connections. So my answer to that is I do my best to make sure that my practice is, although these are big images, I have established processes that keep my practice as light on its feet as possible. So for example, I print on hemp paper, which is the most sort of sustainable stock that you can use. I also, in my stable of photographs and frames, I have a set number of sizes so that the images sort of cycle into those frames and out of those frames. And I also, I work only with quality materials. So these are things that are going to last a long time. And hopefully, with fame and fortune, they'll end up in archives, hint, hint, and in collections. So that's my answer to it, but it's an ongoing process whereby I'm trying really hard to kind of keep things as light on their feet as possible. The other thing that I'm doing, it's not tied to the idea of the materiality of the works themselves, but I've started to try to narrow the focus to things very local, and the things that are quite literally, I just submitted work to a show in the States, which is weeds dug up from my backyard and lit with black light on the bottom and full spectrum on the top. So that's my answer to that, but it is a question that I think a lot about, and I'm sort of doing my best to find practices that are sustainable. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I think it is really important that we have artists' voices to add to science voices around these big issues, and that's where visualizing things becomes really important because it brings those things to our attention in different kinds of ways. I told you before I was really attracted to these works here, and I had another look at them again today. And I was interested that you were talking about, the blue-green algae, which, there's this kind of threatening ominous-thing about that. But when I'm looking at those, I'm finding freshwater shrimp and dragonfly nymphs,
Sure.
all of these things that
Yeah.
signal to me health of the pond.
Yes.
So what I love about that series is that duality feels very hopeful, as well as, bringing the other issues to our attention.
Absolutely. And I mean, that connects back to the very core of all of this work, which is again this sort of paradox or tension between water as generative, water as immensely destructive. So there's and again I love the Mobius strip model. It's you can't look at the thing without considering both of those dimensions to it. And I mean, just as someone who in the film that the sort of films that I watch, the art that I look at, the music that I listen to, it also has that kind of quality to it, right? Where there's sort of this duality of both kind of dark and light, at play at the same time. I'm really into Stanley Kubrick films. The first Alien film, Blade Runner, you know, these films that are undeniably gorgeous, but also very ominous at the same time.
Did you carefully select the layers so that you would have that light against the algae as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, actually, I did them in the printmaking studio. I evaporated all of I had like literally hundreds of these little slides, 0.5 millimeter slides with single drops of water on them. And then it was a matter of like Photoshop without Photoshop, you know, layering things, moving them around and going, that works. That looks like some kind of entity. And if you look at those, I got lucky too. You can see in those images how they move from warm to cool, top to bottom. I put like a lens from a data projector on top, and it broke the light into a spectrum. And then I diffused it to create this sort of warm to cool. But I was also really careful. You'll notice that like some of those forms are tightly contained in the middle, and then other ones are kind of like pushing toward the edges of this circle of containment. So it was sort of a way to speak to this idea of potential volatility, or like this sort of like volatility or potential breaches. Andrew Zafiro's ears just sort of stood up at that word. So yeah, it was really this very hands-on process, intuitive process that was also rooted in just a lot of luck, like
And
looking exactly, and playing with the temperature and learning like, oh wow, like I can make it boil ever slightly and then I turn it off, you know. And I love working in that way. I think it's important to work with, going back to Jessica's question about materiality, it's important to engage with analog materials because they take you to places that you wouldn't otherwise go. You know, when I apply a filter in Photoshop, I know damn well what it's going to look like at the end. And I can see those filters in other people's work. Analog world is different, right? And that's one of the reasons I like to sort of move back and forth between those two ways of working. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah, Derek, right?
It's Derek.
Nice to meet you in 3 dimensions.
Nice to meet you too. You got a great talk. So I was thinking that a lot of environmental art is about flows and in different ways, things that move, which this is too. It's work about the water cycle. But at the same time, you're focusing on what's left behind, or I think you use the word static at some point. So things that remain, things that stay on. And just wondering if you could say more about your thinking or practicing behind that. It is an interesting alternative to focus on flows and movement as sort of what environment is about.
Sure, yeah.
As opposed to things that
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it has to do with the limitations of the medium. You know, I deploy sound a lot to sort of get at that flow that you're talking about, which implies change over time. You know, photography's not good at that. I'm just going to get nailed by a photographer for saying that, but it's like it's one of photography's sort of like weaker points. So I think one of the things I try to do with the materials is figure out like a way to bring them into the medium and sort of like capitalize on what the medium does best. One of the things I really love about photo is the way in which you can sort of stand in front of it and it stays still for you. And slow minds like mine can sort of have the time to get in there and sort of allow for layers of meaning and associations to emerge. So that for me is important. I mean, I'm always trying to figure out ways to get at this idea of dynamics in the photos, but my approach has always been like when I'm making a photograph, I'm not the kind of photographer who like does a one-off and then puts it on the wall. Like I like to work in series because it's through the series that you can get that idea of flow and change and transition from like one state to another. That's about as far as I can get with that question, but I'm going to give it some thought. Yeah, Isa.
Okay, great show. I was going to ask, in what way did this project change you? And what type of things did you feel like you weren't aware of before, or like transformed your perspective afterwards?
I mean, I have to admit, I was not aware of any of these issues before developing the project. So, you know, on one level it was educational. You know, I'm better informed about issues, and again, this is how my practice works. You know, you start with intuition, you get into the studio, you start to play, something happens, and you go, why the heck did that happen? And then you start to research and build up these layers of knowledge and understanding. But also, like, through these projects, I mean, I learned a lot about materiality, about the things that the materials I work with, the technology I work with will and will not do. But with each one of these projects, I was also introduced to a community, you know, and a community played a role in the production of all of these. So the diver, citizen, historian community here, right? The Canada Centre for Inland Waters scientific community on the wall back there. So it's sort of like broadened my networks of people that I communicate with and I work with. But I think also, going back to what I said earlier about like being sensitive to those more subtle gestures of things, you know, there are 200 and some images of those pipes, and you know, 300-400 of these. So you really sort of, you get to this place where it's a reminder of, you can get to a place where kind of like intuition takes over. And like I was talking with Judy, you start to just look and make decisions, and there's this real connection between you and the materials. And you know, in my day job, you know, it's so hectic and there's so many people and so much talking and so much flow of information that I often forget about the importance of like finding those places in yourself. And so every time I look at these images, I'm reminded of the process that went on behind them, and reminded of the importance for me as an individual of creating those kinds of creative spaces. Yeah, Betty.
I'm very drawn to this body of work, and I don't recall if it was intentional or accidental, but the warm and the cool tone within the circle, within the image. It's very rare in photography to see that experience visually, and I just wanted to know, is it intentional or was it accidental? And because the aesthetic is so, I just find it so comforting, but it's not a comforting image.
Sure, yeah.
The content of it, so I was just curious.
Yeah, I mean, the discovery of how that, like I mentioned, it was a total accident. Mark McKenzie in the back corner there gave me a bunch of these lenses from data projectors. And so I was playing around with Petri dishes and stuff, trying to kind of create this sciencey, lensy kind of thing. And it wasn't working, and I put one of these lenses on top of the scanner and went, and it broke the light into this really intense spectrum from hot to cool, from red to blue. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. But it was like intense Technicolor. So then it became like, okay, how do we rein this in? And it was about creating like little structures out of foam core and diffusion material to soften it. And then it was like, okay, how do we fold this into the conceptual structure of the work? And it just seemed to be like a perfect fit. You know, you have the idea of warming and cooling in the water system itself, which is responsible for the emergence of this stuff. You have a reference to the process, which was using heat to evaporate the water, so warm and cool. And then I hope, like on kind of like the most lowest hanging fruit kind of level, there is a reference to climate change and to changes in temperature. But like for me, all that stuff just goes by the wayside when it comes to making a decision about if I'm at a crossroads in a work and it's like, okay, do I go the route that is like full on conceptual at the expense of the aesthetic dimension, or do I kind of like dial back the overt conceptual layers and give the viewer like that aesthetic window within which to engage with the image? Always go for aesthetics. Because for me, again, going back to the idea of the body and the senses, for me anyway, it's just really important to extend that invitation to the viewer. I appreciate it as an art goer. And again, it just comes down to the kind of work that I make. But as Brian Eno once said, like, honor thy error. Again, any sketchbooks in the room, write that one down.
Chris, I don't know if you might know that in a lot of traditional printmaking with black and white printing, they would print in warm black and cool black as a way of getting just fuller kind of dimension of a 2D image.
That's like right down my alley. Yeah. And actually, you might be interested in knowing, this is total geeky photography and sort of tonality stuff. But I also made a mistake in these images back here. When I was neutralizing the black backdrop, I wasn't paying attention, and I left a little bit in the red channel, like 2 notches of red in the red channel. And then I made one of them that was neutral, and I had it on the studio wall, and I'm like, wait, that one looks weird. And I went back in Photoshop, and I'm like, oh, no, I've already printed this stuff. And it has this red sheen to it, very subtle. But when I was looking at them on the wall, the red ones were better because they were more sinister. You know, they were just kind of like very subtly more hot than the completely neutralized ones. So sometimes, you know, these things happen, but they don't happen unless you're making stuff, you know? Yeah, Jessica.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question. I know
Yeah.
this like 10 minutes ago.
It's all good.
I've been thinking, like you kind of like answered that you see this in an archive in the future. But what do you think about like the reason that these materials are out there is because we humans create materials that will last forever.
Right.
And that's kind of like the idea. I want to create these to last forever. And I think that's your answer of why you're doing like physical objects. But like, what do you think about, have you thought about like having other, I'm not talking about digital because digital is also like
Problematic too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just talking the physical object. Have you kind of like thought about like doing something that doesn't last forever, that doesn't really belong to any archive, that is going to be like not destructing because the matter will change,
Yeah.
but it can like integrate
Yeah.
to the nature more than a photography like this. That is beautiful. But
Yeah.
I'm just like imagining this photography like out in the water and maybe kind of like in the
Sure.
ocean. And
Yeah.
a future creates in 100 years.
Yeah.
It would be like, oh, I found this old photograph.
Let's collaborate on that one.
Yeah.
You know, I'm really interested in that, but my practice is kind of like steering a ship. I'm not the type of artist that kind of does a quick about face on things. And as I mentioned, you know, this series in particular is something that I've been working toward for a long time. And like from one project to the next, I leave these little breadcrumbs, you know, so that everything in the end hopefully comes together as a cohesive whole. But yeah, like it's something that's on my mind, and I'm just making these sort of changes to my practice and slowly sort of moving in that direction. I guess the bottom line is I'm not very brave. You know, I'm not like willing to just sort of like, I'm not Wolfgang Tillmans who will like, you know, put, you know, mix frames and unframed and stuff like that on the wall. but it is something that I think a lot about, and I'm moving definitely in that direction. And actually, I'm working. I just finished 2 weeks of work at the Canada Centre for Inland Waters, and the stuff that I photographed there, my instinct tells me that it needs to not be in like an inkjet photographic form. It actually needs to be a print, like an old school analog print. So I'm in conversation with Smokestack right now to learn about the ins and outs of that kind of art making. I've done a little bit of of that sort of hands-on analog work, and it's very ephemeral, but it's going to sort of like be introduced into my practice, sort of like inch by inch.